The most dangerous mistake is the one made with complete confidence. Nobody inside courtroom 4B expected the morning to become unforgettable. The hearing had already attracted unusual attention. Reporters filled nearly every available seat. Attorneys shuffled thick folders across polished wooden tables. Spectators whispered quietly while waiting for proceedings to begin. The large courtroom clock continued its steady march forward beneath the bright fluorescent courthouse lights. Everything appeared routine. Everything appeared controlled. Then, in less than 3 seconds, the atmosphere changed completely. A sudden decision made by Officer Rebecca Collins brought every conversation to an immediate stop. Pens froze above notebooks. Attorneys looked up from legal documents. Even the judge paused in the middle of reviewing paperwork. An uneasy silence spread across the room so quickly that it felt almost unnatural. Rebecca stood near the center aisle, her posture firm and confident. For nearly 10 years she had worked courthouse security. She had built a reputation for acting decisively. While others hesitated, she moved. While others questioned, she trusted her instincts. That confidence had carried her through countless situations. On this particular morning, it told her she was doing exactly the right thing. Across the room stood a man few people had noticed before that moment. Marcus Reed had spent most of the morning sitting quietly several rows back from the front. He had arrived without drawing attention. He had spoken very little. He had simply observed the room with calm patience while occasionally writing notes inside a small notebook. Nothing about him appeared remarkable. Nothing about him appeared threatening. Yet now every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him. What happened next confused nearly everyone present. Marcus did not react the way people expected. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He did not demand explanations. Instead, he remained composed. His expression carried the calm certainty of someone who understood a larger picture that nobody else could see. The contrast was striking. Around him, tension was growing. Within him, there seemed to be none at all. Several reporters exchanged puzzled looks. A few spectators shifted nervously in their seats. Something about the situation felt wrong, but nobody could immediately explain why. Then attention slowly turned toward Judge Harold Whitmore. The veteran judge had spent decades inside courtrooms. He had witnessed emotional testimony, controversial rulings, and high-profile legal battles. Rarely did anything surprise him. Yet the expression on his face now was impossible to ignore. The concern in his eyes did not seem directed toward Marcus. It seemed directed toward the situation itself. That realization sent a ripple of uncertainty through the room. Rebecca noticed it. So did the attorneys. So did the reporters. For the first time that morning, doubt quietly entered the courtroom. Why did the judge suddenly look concerned? Why did several court officials appear uncomfortable? And why did Marcus Reed remain so calm while everyone else seemed increasingly uneasy? The silence stretched longer. Nobody wanted to speak first. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever invisible realization was spreading across the room. Standing beneath the bright courthouse lights, surrounded by attorneys, reporters, and spectators, Officer Rebecca Collins felt a feeling she rarely experienced. Uncertainty. Because deep down, she was beginning to suspect that the quiet man everyone had overlooked might be far more important than anyone had imagined. 2 hours earlier, the courthouse looked completely ordinary. The morning rush had already begun. Attorneys carrying leather briefcases moved through security checkpoints. Court employees balanced stacks of files while crossing long hallways lined with polished floors. Reporters gathered near public notice boards discussing the hearing scheduled for the day. Outside, gray clouds drifted above the city skyline while traffic flowed steadily through downtown streets. Nothing about the morning suggested that before noon an entire courtroom would find itself questioning everything it thought it understood. At 8:11 a.m., Marcus Reed entered through the main courthouse doors carrying a slim black portfolio. He wore a charcoal suit, a white dress shirt, and a conservative tie. His appearance was professional but unremarkable. Most people barely noticed him. A deputy working security greeted him politely. Marcus returned the greeting with a calm smile before continuing toward the interior corridors. He walked at an unhurried pace, taking in details that most visitors ignored. He noticed which courtrooms attracted reporters. He noticed which employees seemed relaxed and which seemed tense. He noticed conversations that ended the moment certain officials entered a room. Years of professional experience had taught him that important information often revealed itself long before anyone realized they were sharing it. Near Courtroom 4B, several journalists were discussing a hearing expected to attract significant public attention. Marcus listened briefly while passing by. He did not interrupt. He did not introduce himself. He simply continued walking. A few minutes later, he entered the courtroom and selected a seat near the fourth row of the gallery. From that position he could observe nearly everyone entering or leaving the room. He placed his portfolio beside him and removed a small notebook. For the next half hour, he quietly recorded observations. Across the courtroom, preparations continued. Court clerks organized exhibits. Attorneys reviewed legal arguments. Spectators slowly filled empty seats. The atmosphere carried the familiar tension that often precedes an important legal proceeding. Everything appeared routine. Yet Marcus seemed more interested in the people than the case itself. Every movement. Every interaction. Every decision. Nothing escaped his attention. Near the entrance, Officer Rebecca Collins began her shift assignment. She checked security procedures, greeted courthouse staff, and monitored the growing crowd. Rebecca had earned a reputation for decisive action. Supervisors appreciated her confidence. Colleagues respected her willingness to make difficult decisions quickly. She believed hesitation created unnecessary risks. That belief had become central to how she viewed her responsibilities. While scanning the room, her eyes briefly settled on Marcus. The moment lasted only a second. Still, something about him stayed in her thoughts. She could not explain why. He was doing nothing unusual. He sat quietly, occasionally writing notes while watching the proceedings around him. Yet Rebecca found herself looking toward him again several minutes later. Then again. Each time she searched for a reason to justify the feeling growing in the back of her mind. Each time she found nothing concrete. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his observations without the slightest indication that he had become the focus of someone's attention. As the courtroom clock moved steadily toward the start of the hearing, two very different people occupied the same room for two very different reasons. One relied on patience and observation. The other relied on instinct and certainty. Neither knew it yet, but before the morning ended, those two approaches would collide in front of everyone. Officer Rebecca Collins had built her career on a simple principle: if something feels wrong, pay attention to it. That philosophy had earned her praise more than once. Supervisors appreciated her alertness. Fellow officers respected her willingness to act when others hesitated. Over time, those experiences reinforced a belief that became central to how she viewed her work. She trusted her instincts. Sometimes she trusted them more than explanations. More than appearances. More than coincidence. On most days, that confidence served her well. On this day, it would lead her somewhere she never expected. As the morning continued, Rebecca moved through the courthouse with the efficiency of someone who knew every hallway, every courtroom, and every routine. She exchanged brief greetings with clerks. She checked entrances. She monitored the growing crowd gathered for the hearing inside Courtroom 4B. Everything appeared normal. Yet her attention kept returning to the same person seated quietly in the fourth row. Marcus Reed. He had done nothing disruptive. He had spoken to no one for more than a few seconds. He had simply observed the room while occasionally writing notes in a small notebook. The behavior itself seemed harmless. Yet the longer Rebecca watched him, the more unusual it felt. Near the courtroom entrance, Deputy Aaron Mitchell noticed her glancing toward the gallery once again. Aaron had worked with Rebecca for several years and understood her habits well. Following her line of sight, he spotted Marcus sitting quietly with his portfolio resting beside him. "You have been watching that guy for almost an hour," Aaron said with a faint smile. Rebecca crossed her arms. "Have you noticed him?" Aaron looked again. "The man taking notes?" Rebecca nodded. "Something about him feels off." Aaron studied Marcus for several seconds before shrugging. "He looks like a lawyer, a witness, or maybe a reporter who forgot his press badge." Rebecca remained silent. Aaron looked back at her. "Did he break a rule?" "No." "Did he bother anyone?" "No." "Did he say something suspicious?" "No." Aaron smiled again. "Then maybe he is exactly what he appears to be." The answer should have settled the matter. Instead, it only increased Rebecca's frustration. She could not point to evidence. She could not identify a violation. All she had was a feeling. Across the room, Marcus stood and walked toward a public information table near the side wall. He reviewed several documents, exchanged a polite greeting with a court clerk, and returned to his seat. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute. The clerk even smiled before returning to her work. Several nearby spectators barely noticed. Rebecca noticed every second. To her, the confidence Marcus carried seemed unusual. He moved through the courthouse as though he belonged there, yet nobody appeared to know him. Meanwhile, Marcus remained completely unaware of the growing attention directed toward him. His focus stayed on the people around him. The attorneys preparing arguments. The court staff organizing exhibits. The reporters comparing notes. Every observation seemed to matter. As the courtroom clock continued ticking toward the start of the hearing, an invisible tension slowly formed beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary morning. One person was gathering facts. The other was gathering impressions. One trusted patience. The other trusted certainty. Neither realized that before the morning ended, those two approaches would collide in front of an entire courtroom and force everyone present to reconsider the difference between instinct and truth. By 9:18 that morning, Courtroom 4B had settled into the quiet rhythm that often precedes an important hearing. The gallery was nearly full. Reporters adjusted notebooks and recording equipment. Attorneys reviewed final arguments while court clerks organized exhibits near the front of the room. Above them, the large courtroom clock continued marking each passing minute with steady precision. To most people, it looked like an ordinary legal proceeding preparing to begin. To Marcus Reed, it looked like a room full of information waiting to reveal itself. Seated in the fourth row, he remained calm and attentive. His notebook rested open on his lap beside several neatly organized documents. Every few minutes he recorded a brief observation before returning his attention to the people around him. His focus rarely stayed on any single individual for long. Instead, he studied interactions. A conversation between attorneys. A clerk responding to a question. A deputy directing visitors toward available seats. Small details often revealed larger patterns. Across the room, Officer Rebecca Collins continued monitoring the growing crowd. The hearing had not yet reached its most important stage, but her attention remained fixed on Marcus more often than she wanted to admit. The feeling made little sense. He had violated no rules. He had caused no disruption. Yet every time she looked toward the gallery, her eyes found him again. She noticed the notebook. She noticed the way he watched people. She noticed how comfortable he seemed despite sitting among strangers. The confidence bothered her because she could not explain it. Near the side wall, an elderly spectator accidentally dropped several papers while attempting to organize a folder. Before anyone else reacted, Marcus stood and helped gather the documents. The man thanked him warmly. Marcus smiled politely and returned the papers without lingering. Several people nearby appreciated the gesture and returned to their conversations. Rebecca observed the entire interaction. It should have reassured her. Instead, it deepened the unanswered questions in her mind. Why did he seem familiar with courthouse procedures? Why did he move through the building as though he belonged there? A few minutes later, Judge Harold Whitmore entered through a side door and took his place behind the bench. Conversations gradually faded. The atmosphere shifted toward professional seriousness. Attorneys stood briefly before taking their seats again. Reporters prepared fresh pages of notes. As the judge reviewed preliminary documents, his eyes moved slowly across the courtroom. For the briefest moment, they paused on Marcus. The pause lasted less than a second. Most people never noticed. Marcus showed no reaction at all. Judge Whitmore immediately returned his attention to the paperwork in front of him. Yet something about the exchange felt important. Rebecca noticed it. So did one veteran reporter seated near the front row. Neither understood its significance. The hearing officially began. Legal arguments were introduced. Documents changed hands. Court personnel moved efficiently between tables. Through it all, Marcus remained quiet, listening carefully to every word. He appeared less interested in the outcome of the case than in the conduct of the people participating in it. Rebecca continued watching from her position near the entrance. Neither of them spoke. Neither approached the other. Yet an invisible tension continued growing beneath the surface of the room. One person was collecting facts. The other was collecting impressions. One trusted evidence. The other trusted instinct. And as the hearing moved steadily forward beneath the bright courthouse lights, both were unknowingly approaching the moment that would force everyone present to discover which approach deserved their trust. The hearing had been underway for nearly 40 minutes when the moment arrived. It did not announce itself with noise. It did not appear dramatic at first. In fact, most people in courtroom 4B barely noticed it when it began. Judge Harold Whitmore was reviewing a series of procedural documents while attorneys presented arguments from opposite sides of the room. Reporters continued filling pages with notes. Spectators listened quietly from the gallery. The atmosphere remained orderly, professional, and predictable. Yet hidden beneath that routine, a small misunderstanding was already taking shape. Marcus Reed remained seated in the fourth row, listening carefully. His notebook rested beside his portfolio. From time to time he recorded a brief observation before returning his attention to the proceedings. He seemed completely focused on the hearing. Near the entrance, Officer Rebecca Collins maintained her position while monitoring the room. Her attention continued returning to Marcus. By now she had spent most of the morning watching him. Every ordinary action seemed to reinforce a concern she could not fully explain. The feeling had become so familiar that she no longer questioned it. She simply accepted it. Then an unexpected issue emerged at the front of the courtroom. A court clerk approached the judge with a document that appeared incomplete. Judge Whitmore reviewed it briefly and exchanged a few quiet words with the clerk. Several attorneys began searching through their files. The discussion stalled. For a moment, uncertainty spread through the proceedings. From his seat, Marcus appeared to recognize the problem immediately. He opened his portfolio and carefully removed a sealed folder. The movement was calm and deliberate. He glanced toward the front of the courtroom as though preparing to provide information relevant to the matter being discussed. Several people nearby barely paid attention. To them, it looked entirely ordinary. Rebecca noticed it instantly. The concerns she had been building throughout the morning suddenly seemed to confirm themselves inside her mind. She saw Marcus stand with the sealed folder and begin moving toward the aisle. Before he could take more than a step, she instructed him to stop. The command echoed clearly enough for nearby spectators to hear. Conversations immediately faded. Marcus stopped exactly where he was. He did not argue. He did not protest. He simply explained that he believed he possessed documentation that might assist the court regarding the issue under discussion. His tone remained respectful and measured. Yet Rebecca had already committed herself to an assumption. Around the courtroom, heads began turning. Attorneys paused mid-conversation. Reporters lowered their pens. The atmosphere shifted so quickly that even the courtroom clock seemed louder than before. Marcus remained still, holding the sealed folder carefully in front of him. Then, as attention focused on the unexpected exchange, the folder slipped from his hand and landed on the polished floor near the center aisle. The sound echoed throughout the room. Silence followed immediately. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye shifted toward the folder. Then something unexpected happened. Judge Whitmore stared at it. Not casually. Not with irritation. With recognition. Slowly, the veteran judge rose from the bench. The movement alone changed the atmosphere. Rebecca felt uncertainty touch her confidence for the first time all morning. Because the concern now visible on the judge's face was not directed at Marcus Reed. It was directed at the possibility that a serious mistake had just been made. The silence inside courtroom 4B felt heavier than any argument presented that morning. Nobody seemed willing to move. Nobody seemed willing to speak. Even the reporters who had been writing continuously throughout the hearing now sat frozen with their pens suspended above open notebooks. Judge Harold Whitmore slowly stepped down from the bench and walked toward the sealed folder resting near the center aisle. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor. Every eye followed him. Officer Rebecca Collins remained standing nearby. Only moments earlier she had felt completely certain of her decision. Now that certainty was beginning to erode. The judge bent down and carefully picked up the folder. For several seconds he simply examined the markings attached to the cover. Then his expression changed. The shift was subtle but impossible to miss. A quiet murmur spread through the gallery. Attorneys exchanged confused glances. Court staff looked toward one another as though searching for an explanation. Judge Whitmore opened the folder just enough to review the identification attached inside. The reaction that followed immediately captured the attention of everyone present. He closed the folder again and looked directly at Marcus Reed. What surprised people most was not concern. It was recognition. Genuine recognition. "Mr. Reed," the judge said quietly. The room became even more silent. Marcus remained standing exactly where he was. "Your Honor," he replied calmly. The brief exchange sent another wave of confusion through the courtroom. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. The judge clearly knew him. Not casually. Not as a distant acquaintance. There was a level of professional respect in the judge's voice that had not been present earlier. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench carrying the folder. He adjusted his glasses and reviewed the identification once more. Several long seconds passed before he finally spoke. "The court will pause briefly." No explanation followed. No additional details were offered. Yet the announcement itself signaled that something highly unusual had occurred. Attorneys immediately stopped discussing the case. Reporters leaned forward with renewed attention. Court personnel stood waiting for instructions. Through it all, Marcus remained composed. He showed no frustration. No anger. No desire to challenge anyone. He simply waited. Rebecca watched him carefully. The calmness no longer looked ordinary. It looked deliberate. It looked like the confidence of someone who understood exactly who he was and exactly why he was there. The judge looked up again. "Mr. Reed," he said carefully, choosing each word, "I was not expecting today's events to unfold in this manner." Several people in the gallery exchanged puzzled looks. The statement raised more questions than answers. Marcus nodded politely. "Neither was I, Your Honor." The response only deepened the mystery. Rebecca glanced around the room. She could feel the atmosphere shifting. What had begun as a routine hearing now felt like something entirely different. The focus was no longer on the scheduled case. It was on Marcus Reed. Who was he? Why did the judge recognize him? Why did experienced attorneys suddenly appear uneasy? The questions spread through the courtroom like a silent current. Then Judge Whitmore placed the folder carefully on the bench and took a slow breath. The look on his face suggested that a major revelation was approaching. And for the first time that day, Officer Rebecca Collins began to realize that the quiet man she had spent hours watching might possess an authority far greater than anyone in the room had imagined. For several long seconds, nobody inside courtroom 4B seemed willing to speak. The silence carried a strange weight, as though everyone present understood that whatever happened next would permanently change the meaning of everything that had happened before. Judge Harold Whitmore looked down at the identification documents one final time before setting them carefully on the bench. Then he raised his eyes toward the gallery. "For the record," he said calmly, "I believe it is important that the court understands who Mr. Marcus Reed is." Reporters immediately straightened in their seats. Attorneys stopped whispering. Court clerks exchanged uncertain glances. Even the spectators who had arrived expecting an ordinary hearing now leaned forward with complete attention. Marcus remained standing near the aisle, his expression composed and respectful. He neither encouraged nor resisted the attention. He simply waited. Judge Whitmore folded his hands. Mr. Reed serves as a senior federal oversight investigator assigned to a multi-agency accountability review involving public institutions throughout this region. The words moved through the courtroom like a wave. Several attorneys visibly reacted. One reporter quickly turned a page in her notebook and began writing as fast as possible. Rebecca Collins felt her heartbeat quicken. She stared at Marcus, trying to reconcile the quiet man she had watched all morning with the title she had just heard. The judge continued. Over the past 11 months, Mr. Reed has supervised reviews involving procedural compliance, public accountability standards, and professional conduct assessments across multiple jurisdictions. The room became even quieter. Suddenly Marcus's behavior throughout the morning made sense. The notebook. The observations. The patience. The attention to detail. He had not been attending the hearing as a curious observer. He had been evaluating the environment around him. Rebecca remembered every assumption she had made. Every conclusion she had reached without evidence. Every moment she had convinced herself that instinct alone was enough. None of it felt convincing anymore. Judge Whitmore looked toward Marcus with visible respect. "Mr. Reed's work has contributed to several major oversight findings over the past decade," he said. "His reputation for professionalism is known throughout both state and federal circles." The revelation stunned many people in the room. Yet what surprised them most was Marcus himself. He showed no pride. No arrogance. No desire to embarrass anyone. He stood exactly as he had stood when nobody knew who he was. Calm. Measured. Professional. One of the reporters finally spoke. "Mr. Reed, were you observing this hearing as part of your review?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I was observing procedures, interactions, and professional conduct," he answered. His voice remained steady. "The same way I do every day." The simplicity of the response somehow made it even more powerful. Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. "Then I believe everyone present understands the significance of today's events." Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. For the first time since the morning began, she was no longer thinking about authority. She was thinking about responsibility. As the reality of Marcus Reed's identity settled across the courtroom, a new realization emerged. The most influential person in the room had never demanded attention. He had earned respect through patience, discipline, and a commitment to fairness. The hidden truth was finally visible, and nothing about the day would ever be viewed the same way again. The atmosphere inside Courtroom 4B changed completely after the revelation. What had begun as a routine hearing now felt like a lesson unfolding in real time. Reporters continued writing furiously. Attorneys sat quietly, absorbing the significance of everything they had just learned. Even the spectators seemed different now. The questions that had filled the room earlier had largely disappeared. In their place stood a clearer understanding of what had happened and why it mattered. Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted the documents on the bench and looked toward the court recorder. "The record will reflect today's events in full," he said calmly. The statement sounded procedural, but everyone understood its importance. Nothing would be overlooked. Nothing would be ignored. Accountability depended on accuracy, and accuracy required transparency. Marcus Reed remained standing near the aisle. He had become the center of attention without ever seeking it. Throughout the entire morning, he had behaved exactly the same way. The only thing that had changed was what everyone else now knew about him. Officer Rebecca Collins stood several feet away, struggling to reconcile the assumptions she had made with the reality sitting before her. For years she had trusted her instincts above nearly everything else. That confidence had guided countless decisions. Yet standing in that courtroom, she was beginning to understand the danger of reaching conclusions before gathering facts. The realization was uncomfortable. It was also necessary. Near the rear of the courtroom, a county administrative supervisor quietly entered and spoke with courthouse personnel. Several documents were exchanged. Procedures that rarely attracted public attention were now being set into motion. There was no drama in the process. No raised voices. No public confrontation. Just the steady operation of a system designed to review decisions when questions arose. Judge Whitmore acknowledged the supervisor with a brief nod. Appropriate administrative review procedures will follow, he stated for the record. The words echoed softly through the room. Rebecca understood exactly what they meant. The events of the morning would be examined carefully. Reports would be reviewed. Witness statements would be collected. Every step would be documented. For the first time all day, she realized that accountability was not something applied only to other people. It applied equally to everyone entrusted with responsibility. Across the courtroom, Marcus watched quietly. There was no satisfaction in his expression. No sense of victory. He understood something many people never fully learned. Real accountability was not about punishment. It was about trust. Communities trusted institutions because those institutions were willing to examine themselves honestly when mistakes occurred. One of the reporters finally looked toward Marcus. "Do you intend to submit a statement regarding today's events?" she asked. Marcus paused before answering. "The facts will speak for themselves," he replied. The simplicity of the response seemed to settle over the room. Nothing more needed to be said. As the hearing gradually resumed, the focus slowly returned to the original legal matter before the court. Yet everyone present knew they had witnessed something larger than a courtroom proceeding. They had witnessed the moment when assumptions collided with facts. They had witnessed the difference between authority and responsibility. And as Officer Rebecca Collins stood quietly beneath the courthouse lights, she began to understand that the most important lesson of the day was not about power. It was about the obligation to use power carefully, fairly, and with the humility to recognize when certainty moves ahead of the truth. By late afternoon, the courthouse had begun returning to its normal rhythm. Attorneys packed away case files. Reporters gathered final notes before leaving for their newsrooms. Court employees resumed familiar routines beneath the steady glow of fluorescent lights. The tension that had dominated the day was slowly fading, yet the lessons remained. Inside courtroom 4B, the hearing had concluded. The benches that had been filled only hours earlier now sat mostly empty. Long beams of sunlight stretched across polished wooden floors as the afternoon moved quietly toward evening. Marcus Reed remained near the front of the courtroom, organizing documents inside his portfolio. He worked with the same calm professionalism he had displayed from the moment he entered the building that morning. Nothing about his demeanor suggested triumph. Nothing suggested resentment. To Marcus, the events of the day were never about proving someone wrong. They were about ensuring that institutions remained worthy of the public trust placed in them. Across the room, Officer Rebecca Collins stood in thoughtful silence. The confidence that had guided her throughout the morning had been replaced by reflection. For the first time in years, she had been forced to confront the difference between certainty and evidence. It was not a comfortable realization. Yet part of her understood its value. Responsibility demanded more than authority. It demanded patience. It demanded discipline. Most importantly, it demanded the humility to question assumptions before acting upon them. Judge Harold Whitmore finished reviewing several final documents before closing the last folder on his bench. He looked across the nearly empty courtroom and allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. During his decades on the bench, he had learned that the most important lessons rarely emerged from dramatic rulings. They emerged from moments when ordinary people were reminded why fairness mattered. Today's lesson had arrived unexpectedly, but its meaning could not have been clearer. As Marcus prepared to leave, one of the younger court clerks approached him. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Reed," she said politely, "after everything that happened today, how do you stay so calm?" Marcus paused before answering. He looked around the courtroom. The empty witness stand. The judge's bench. The rows of benches where spectators had spent the day watching events unfold. Then he offered a small smile. "Because accountability is not personal," he replied. "It only works when it applies equally to everyone." The clerk nodded thoughtfully. The answer stayed with her long after the conversation ended. A few minutes later, Marcus stepped into the hallway. His footsteps echoed softly against the courthouse floor. Outside, the clouds that had covered the city that morning had finally broken apart. Warm sunlight illuminated the courthouse steps as people moved through the downtown streets below. Life continued. New hearings would take place tomorrow. New decisions would be made. New challenges would arrive. Yet, everyone who had witnessed the events of that day would carry something with them. They would remember how quickly assumptions can become mistakes. They would remember that authority without accountability eventually loses its meaning. And they would remember the quiet man who never demanded respect, yet earned it through patience, professionalism, and dignity. As Marcus walked away from the courthouse, one final truth seemed to linger in the evening air. Some people believe power comes from a title. Others believe it comes from a badge. But real authority begins the moment a person accepts responsibility for their actions, and real justice survives only when the truth matters more than certainty.